Hello, good morning. My name is Amy Lensing-Tate. I'm the Interim Executive Director at the UWM Alumni Association. Thank you for joining us for the first in our new online series of mobile master chats. While we can't be together on campus, we're so pleased to continue to bring you the expertise from our distinguished faculty. Throughout the webinar, you'll have a chance to add questions to the chat feature, which is located on the right side of your video. We've reserved time at the end for questions from the audience, but please feel free to chat in those questions any point during the webinar as they occur to you. You may remember Dr. Roebber from his wildly popular in-person master chat, which drew over 200 people to campus. He's the founder and director of Innovative Weather and a distinguished professor of atmospheric sciences at UWM. He's edited and published extensively in scientific research literature on the analysis and modeling of weather and climate dynamics. He's also a co-author of a book titled Minding the Weather, published by MIT Press. In addition to his various duties at UWM, he has also been a visiting scientist at several National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration laboratories and the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He's the recipient of multiple awards, including the American Meteorological Society's Editor Award, the MIT Club of Wisconsin Tech Award, the UWM Research Foundation Senior Faculty Award, and the UWM Distinguished Undergraduate Teaching Award. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Roebber.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you everyone for attending virtually. So I asked this question, it's kind of a leading provocative question, and I'll cut to the chase and give you the answer right away. Turns out it can tell us quite a bit about climate change. There's a number of remarkable parallels between what's happening with COVID-19 and what is happening with climate change. These parallels are both in terms of the mechanics, sort of the fundamentals of the process, and also our societal capacity for an effective response to these kinds of threats. So that's really what I'm going to focus on here. Having difficulty changing the slides. So there we go. So the first problem that we encounter is the problem of exponential growth. And people generally are what I would call linear thinkers. They don't really tend to think about things in terms of a doubling timescale over a short period of time. And so because of that, we kind of extrapolate based on a flat trend. And if you look, this is from about a week ago, I believe, confirmed COVID-19 cases. Obviously, it's continued to go up, but you can see that clearly that curve has bent upward substantially. It's not a linear trend from the early stages. If you look on the right, you'll see the global temperature and carbon dioxide in yellow, global temperature in red. You see a lot of year-to-year fluctuation in the temperature, but the overall trends in the two are quite clear and very similar to what we see with COVID-19. In other words, it's an exponential increase. A couple of years ago, the World Meteorological Organization announced that we'd reached carbon dioxide concentrations globally that are the highest in almost the past million years. So that's an incredible problem that we're encountering at this point. And the growth, because it's exponential, is increasing very rapidly. And the reason we should care about this is because there's a problem of delay in exponential growth. And this is something that was shown in a study, a modeling study of COVID-19. So this basically is the number of cases of coronavirus. The black line shows you that number as a function of number of days on the x-axis. And so the black line shows you if you don't do any social distancing, what happens, and you can see how fast that curve starts to bend upwards. Social distancing, if you do it on day n plus 20, that's the sort of, I'm not sure what that color is, maybe sort of a greenish color. You can see that curve starts to bend at some point, and so you get off that exponential growth and you start to plateau. If you do social distancing just one day later, it still follows that same pattern that it starts to flatten out, which is what we want. But the difference in the number of cases is a 40% increase by just that one day delay. So that's a huge impact in terms of the effect of COVID-19 and how we respond to it. And of course, we know in the United States, that's exactly what we did. And it was not one day, it was weeks that we delayed. Same thing is happening, unfortunately, with global carbon emissions. And so when people are doing climate modeling, they look at different emission scenarios to see what will happen if we follow different kinds of pathways. And so on the left-hand figure, what you see here is what's labeled RCP 8.5, which is the higher emission scenario. And effectively what that means is we keep on doing what we have been doing, which is the path that we're on. We haven't really changed anything. And so that you can think of as business as usual, the current path. The other two are lower emission scenarios with fairly extensive intervention at some point, indicated in the blue-greenish one, and then even more extensive intervention indicated in the more direct green curve. And so you can see you start to bend those emissions by taking those steps. What you see in terms of the right-hand curve is the global average temperature change. So again, the red line represents the business as usual scenario, and it keeps going up to very high levels. And note that the temperature here is a global average temperature. This is not the temperature in your backyard. This is the temperature averaged over every point in the globe. And there's some places around the world that experience more temperature change than others. So that's important to keep in mind. The regional influence is typically substantially larger than this. But you also see the importance here is that you also see, even with those cutbacks in the lower emission scenarios, it takes some time for that to have an impact. And you don't stop it at whatever the point is that you take that step. It still is going to go up for some time afterwards. So in other words, anything we're doing today is going to take a little while for us to feel any kind of significant impact, but it's really important that you intervene sooner rather than later. The problem is, to summarize, that the delay makes what is already a bad situation much worse. So just to kind of summarize that, and by the way, if you want some sort of background reading material on climate change, I highly recommend the Fourth National Climate Assessment. That's something that is required that the US government issue every few years, and it's assessment of the climate. Even though it's focused on the United States impacts, it also takes into account, obviously, the global conditions, and very well done in terms of its scientific expertise, and also in contrast to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, which are also very comprehensive and are global in terms of coverage. The problem with the IPCC reports is I find them difficult to read, even me as a scientific expert in the subject. It's not communicated particularly clearly. That's not the case with the National Climate Assessment, so I really do recommend that as a go-to resource for you if you're interested in reading more about this. So I want to focus a little bit here on sea level rise for two reasons. One, it's not something that we think about much here in the Midwest, obviously not being on the coast. And also because it turns out that this is one of the most major impacts, major threats that we're likely to see in the coming century. And even though we're not on the coast, any impacts that are felt on the coast of the US are going to be significant all across the country. So what are the threats from sea level rise? Under a lower emission scenario, it's like 1 to 3 feet of sea level rise by 2100, 4 to 6 feet in a business as usual scenario. As I mentioned, that's kind of where we're at right now, is looking at this higher level. That's a huge amount of sea level rise, as I'll show you in a minute. I should also point out that the long-term commitment under business as usual, thinking about that exponential growth curve, what that means is that at some point you pass the threshold at which you will have lost all of the Greenland ice sheet. And even if you take major dramatic steps after that point is passed, you can't stop that melting. And so the long-term commitment from business as usual scenario at some point and we don't know where that threshold is at this point, would be 125 feet of sea level rise. Now that would occur over centuries to millennia. So it's not something we would see in the next century, let's say by 2100, but that's what we would be bequeathing to our ancestors if we were to continue under the scenario. So that's obviously a huge impact. Why is this important for us in the Midwest? If you look, for example, at the percentage of land area that are in coastal regions in the United States, basically coastal zone counties, it's about 40% of employment, almost 50% of our economy, and 40% of our population are in those places, which means they actually have part of the county right on the coast, either the east coast of the US, the west coast of the US, or the Gulf Coast. And the impacts that are felt in those areas are clearly going to have an impact all across the country. And we've seen that, for example, just in the COVID-19, where when you start shutting down the economy in important parts of the US, it affects everybody. And that will be the same thing with this. About immigration and refugee crises that we've been seeing now, that's nothing compared to what would happen with this sort of impact. Just to give you an example of this, this is labeled the extreme scenario, 2100. It's really the business as usual scenario. In other words, the pathway that we're on. This is a picture of downtown Boston. I happen to come from Boston, so it's one that I can fully appreciate. If you've ever flown into Boston, Logan Airport is almost in the center of this picture. And this is what it looks like today. This is what it would look like in 2100, where those blue shaded regions are areas that are now underwater in 2100. And it's a huge part of Boston. And so unless you take dramatic steps, such as in the Netherlands, where you build dikes and things like that, this is what you'll be experiencing. And the costs to do that, of course, are enormous. I know that New York City, for example, is already working on plans to do precisely that, because they're also strongly affected by this. I should also point out that, this is, even though this issue, like COVID-19, is being politicized to a great extent, serious people are considering this as a serious risk. So for example, the Pentagon, which is not exactly a left-wing group, is commenting that climate change is one of the most significant risks to national security. And in the Davos Forum, they've been identifying climate and cyber risks as top concerns for time. So the takeaway from this, and I deliberately kept this fairly short so that there'll be a lot of time for questions, because I'm sure you'll have them. But there are a number of takeaways that I wanted you to understand from this. The first is, these are, whether you're talking about COVID-19 or you're talking about climate change, these are fundamentally science issues. Our understanding of it is based on science. But in order to do anything about it, it requires socio-political actions. And that's where, the public understanding of this is very important. Tends to operate kind of in the gaps between understanding to some extent, unfortunately. And so the more that people really are not fooled by that, the more they're able to force leaders to actually take a leadership position on these kinds of issues. The second takeaway is that there's a lag between any action and nature's response. So we do something, we tend to have a crisis management mode in this country, and you saw it play out again with COVID-19. It was very clear what was coming. The train was coming down the tracks. We could see the headlights, but we didn't do anything about it. We waited until it actually was very clear. And as I indicated before, because of that exponential growth, delay is very costly. And so there's a lag between any action. You can't wait until it becomes very, very obvious that there's a crisis. You have to understand that that's already the case and take action ahead of that if you want to limit the damage. And there are, as COVID-19 has also shown us, there are economic and human costs whether you take action or you don't take action. And this is why it's really important that you focus on what we actually understand about these issues and not politicize it, but really understand it and respect the science and what the science can and can't tell us about what's happening, because these are very impactful decisions that you have to make. And because of all these things, one would hope that would motivate rational consideration with emphasis on expertise and evidence. But I think it's very apparent that this hasn't been the case in either our response to COVID-19 or to climate change. We've clearly seen this. And so one of the most significant differences, which is possibly a small ray of optimism that I'd like to leave you with, is that the time scale for something like a pandemic is very different than the time scale for climate change. Climate change is over much longer time periods. That also gives you a little bit more opportunity to delay. Unfortunately, you can keep putting it off and say priority, but it also gives you more time to really consider what you need to do, what the best actions might be in order to deal with it. So we actually, regardless of the fact that we have delayed for considerable time, and just as a point on that, when I was still a graduate student, we were talking about climate change. This was 30 years ago. And we were talking about climate change and what the societal response to it would be, understanding that it was already a significant threat. In those 30 years, we've continued on the business as usual path. We still have time to take significant actions that will help reduce that, but we're losing time. And that timeline for actually affecting a useful response is getting shorter with each passing year. So that's where I'd like to leave it and go to your questions. So one question I'm seeing now is that with the majority of the United States around the world staying home, we've seen an improvement in the environment. And these improvements have been dramatic. Of course, this has been with a nearly universal shutdown of industry in our economy. And so you can see that we actually have a lot of leverage in terms of improving the environment. We can do a lot. And so the takeaway from this is that we have actions that we can take that can help to improve the environment. We don't have to do it all at once. We don't have to just shut everything down. That's where you start thinking about, okay, how can we invest in the future, invest in technical and technological improvements in how we produce energy and how we use energy that will limit the impact. Because we can see quite clearly from COVID-19 and the improvement in the environment that has taken place over a very short time period that we have leverage. I suppose one thing I can comment on is in terms of global versus regional that I touched upon before. When we think about climate change, you often hear numbers that reflect the global climate change. For example, this year, 2020, is on track to be the #1 warmest year in the instrumented record. That surpasses the last year. I think it was 2016, which was an El Nino year, which amplifies the temperature response. And this year is not an El Nino year. So that's pretty dramatic. In fact, every year of the last 5 years has been in the top 5 warmest years on the record. And before that, it was the last 4 of the 5 and 3 of the 5 and so on. And so we continue to set global records. And this may seem a little bit counterintuitive to people in Wisconsin because we haven't always seen especially warm here over the last years, let's say. There have been a couple of winters that were actually relatively cold. And so that's just a reflection of the fact that the climate change that you experience around the globe is not uniform from one year to the next and is not uniform everywhere around the earth. It will vary because there's a lot of variability in the climate system. So I'm seeing a new question here. what lessons are we learning from the COVID-19 crisis that can be applied to climate change solutions? I think one of the prime lessons, again, is to not delay until conditions are so overwhelmingly obvious that we then start taking action. In other words, a crisis mode action standpoint. And again, as I mentioned before, the problem with climate change is because it does happen over long time periods. It's very easy to fall into the mode where, yes, we know it's important, but there are other things that are happening right now that really have to take our attention, because we can always make that argument. And then at some point you reach the crisis point, the tipping point, if you like, where it's really too late to really avoid the worst consequences. And so that's what we want to do, is get ahead of this problem as much as we can. As I mentioned before, we've already spent the past 30 years, I hate to use the word dithering, but I'm going to use it anyway, dithering about climate change, when we know quite clearly the science is very clear about what the big picture is. I should point out that we've understood the basic process of climate change for hundreds of years. This is nothing new. All the research that's been done over the last 30 years or so is to try to pin this down to much more specific information that can then be used to translate to specific actions. And that's, very difficult, because the climate, the weather, the climate is highly variable in space and time. And so it takes a lot of work to be able to tease that apart, to understand what those local scale, regional scale influences are. But the fundamental issue that you have to understand is you cannot wait until it's very, very obvious that we've reached that point before taking action. Next question. What are the most important practical things people should be doing in their everyday lives to help slow climate change now and post COVID-19? I'd say right now, everything we're doing to respond to COVID-19 is also very helpful from a climate change perspective. So there's really nothing I think you need to worry about in addition to that. You've got plenty on your plates at this point, and it also actually helps just by staying at home and social distancing, because we're not using nearly as much energy, helps in terms of our response to climate change. The carbon emissions are reduced. Longer term, there's two things. There are lots of things that you can do on an individual level, primarily reflecting back to energy use. How can you reduce your consumption of energy? What are the best ways that you can do to take that? And there are lots of ways that you can do that. Some that are direct, driving less, things like that. Many of the things that we would be most effective, however, require a combination of things at the individual level, but also top-down level. So if you think about leadership at the national and state levels, state leaders, national leaders have to put in place the infrastructure that helps us to do those things. If you make it very hard, for example, for people to move about without taking a car, they're going to take a car because they need to. And so you need to have an infrastructure that allows people to do it in ways that are seamless. And we don't have that in our national system. There are large places, large countries in the world that have much better transportation systems outside of simply cars than we do. So that's one thing that we can think about, is how do we motivate our leadership to get ahead of this problem and start taking action. So anything you can do to motivate leadership also. So it's a combination of top down and bottom up, and applying that pressure to state and national leaders that they really have to get serious about this. If the question is about predictions with respect to climate change, the science doesn't change. Sometimes there's, what I would call chaff that's thrown up by politicians about the science, but the science itself continues on its progress, and science has the advantage of being an iterative, self-correcting process. So basically, someone will do a study it gets vetted by other scientists before it's even published. And then other scientists continue to explore that question and do their own studies of it. And that's the accumulation of those individual efforts that help us to really narrow in and hone down on what the real signals are and the data that we have and the models that we use and all those kinds of things. So it's a very important difference between doing that and sort of the lurching back and forth that we have in sort of in our politics. It's a very different mode of operation. On that last question, I would also point out that as far as predictions are concerned, one of the things I would say, you know, we talk about, okay, future climate change and predictions associated with that. One of the things that we've seen so far in most of the data that we've been measuring is that the climate change predictions, if you go back, say 10 years ago or 15 years ago, you can see that as the years go by, we can see that most of the predictions have been underestimates of the actual change. So we're actually seeing a stronger impact than what some of the predictions were saying. It's not a political influence on that, it's a reflection of getting better, a stronger signal and being able to understand that a little better. The next question, what's the difference between global warming and climate change? Climate change deniers always seem to focus on global warming. I think that's a really good question. And I actually prefer the term climate change to global warming. And the reason is because climate is highly variable in space and time. And what that means is that if you go in the warmest 5 years, which are the last years that we've had globally, you can find places in which the temperature change was negative compared to the long-term average. And in one year that might have been the globally warmest year, it could still have been a cooler year. And we saw that we had a really cold winter a few years ago. That was a then record-setting warm year, but we weren't warm here. That doesn't mean climate change is not occurring or that globally there is warming occurring. Another thing is to understand that it's not all about just the temperature. It's also about storm systems. It's about sea level rise, which is not directly, it's indirectly the temperature. All of those things are also really important as far as the climate that we experience. Also, I like to use this little saying about what's the difference between climate and weather. Climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. And what that means is that climate is really the aggregation of all those individual weather events. And so that variability from day to day, what we experience in our weather, those weather systems is also very important in terms of the climate that we experience. Another way to think that is here in the Midwest, our annual average temperature is not a whole lot different than it is in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. But we know that our climate is significantly different from, say, places like Seattle or Portland, Oregon. So it's important to understand that those variations from year to year are also. Okay, so the next question. How much will a transition to electric cars help mitigate climate change? So there are two elements to energy usage. And one is, you know, the direct use of energy by an electric car. But of course, also in order to run your electric car, you have to charge it. And so there's energy generation that's required. Also, if you have to manufacture that car, there's energy required to do the manufacture. So it's actually not as simple a calculation as you might think, but in net over sufficient time, that will certainly reduce our use of or our emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So it's a help, but it's not as simple as just saying that's the answer. All we have to do is all drive electric cars and we'll be done. I should also say that there is no one single magic bullet. There are a lot of things that have to be done in order to address something of this scale. And that's, again, also another reason why just people doing things on an individual level is not enough. We also need to have state, national, and frankly, international cooperation and leadership on this issue to make much headway. Next one is talking about how the data is readily available and clear, and we haven't made any significant societal change. And so really good question is, what do you think will drive the necessary action? So it's an open question. Will anything drive the necessary action, or will we wait until we reach that obvious crisis stage and then attempt to do whatever we can at that point to modify that? So I'm a physical scientist. I can't say that I understand human psychology to the degree that would be necessary to fully answer that question. But I do think that, giving as clear and direct information as possible to everyone is the first step in doing that, and helping people to understand what that really means. Because ultimately, it's up to everyone to decide that this is important enough to take action. In a democratic system such as we have, that means that you have to exercise influence on your political leaders to get them to take this seriously as you do. Will sea level rise have any effect on the water level in the Great Lakes? Water level in the Great Lakes is a really interesting question. It turns out sea level rise does not, but climate change itself has a significant influence on Great Lakes water levels. And I've actually done some studies on this. And a few years ago, you may have heard people talking about how this was going to drive Great Lakes water levels down because of increased evaporation. It turns out it's more complicated than that. And what it really seems to indicate is more than likely the biggest influence of climate change will be more variation in the water levels in the Great Lakes. So right now we're going to near record highs in the water levels from a record low that we hit in 2013. And we've always historically had a lot of variation in Lake Michigan water levels. And that will continue, but it will be amplified, it looks like, from the climate signal. And the reason for that is because you're affecting how much ice coverage there is in the wintertime because of the warming temperatures in some years, but not in every year. And so if you have a warm winter, the subsequent water temperatures the following summer are also much warmer, much increased evaporation, and that tends to drive the water levels down, subject to how much precipitation you also get. And precipitation is driven upwards by climate change. So it's this balance between precipitation and evaporation. And then added into that, you have the effect of some years when you do have a cold winter and you do have more ice coverage over the Great Lakes. And so the evaporation is significantly reduced the following summer, and that will drive the lake levels up. So the influence seems to be we will probably see lake levels that are as high or higher than we've ever seen in the instrumented record, but we will also see lake levels that are lower than we've ever seen in the instrumented record. It's just that roller coaster from highs to lows is much steeper than it was previously. I should also say that variability associated with climate change is something that isn't talked about very much, not just with respect to water levels, but in general, just year to year variability. The kinds of climate we experience, the more variable climate that we experience, is something that we don't hear a lot about. Mostly it's about averages, but it's really, as I mentioned before, it's the day-to-day aggregation of those individual events that makes up our climate. And so understanding more about that variability is an ongoing area of active climate change research that I think will help us to understand that better. So we've returned to the main screen, which I think is a signal of some sort.
All right, thank you, Dr. Roebber, for that timely and thought-provoking chat. Thank you as well to the nearly 100 alums from across the country that are watching from their homes. Look for more digital opportunities coming up, including the same time next week when we will have a chat presented by Matthew Friedel from the School of Information Studies at UWM, talking about artificial intelligence, big data, and